The sun shone brightly the day Alex pulled into the driveway of his new home. A wide grin spread across his face as he stepped out of the car, taking in the quiet cul-de-sac, the trimmed hedges, the neat sidewalks, and the distant hum of sprinklers. It was exactly what he had envisioned: peaceful, safe, and well-kept. For a man in his early 30s who'd worked countless overtime hours and skipped vacations to afford this place, it felt like stepping into a reward he'd long dreamed of. The house itself was charming. A modest 2-story with stone siding and a covered porch that overlooked a sprawling backyard. The yard was what truly sold him. The back end of the lot stretched into a patch of undeveloped land with towering oaks and room for anything his imagination could conjure. A greenhouse, a fire pit, maybe even a koi pond. It was more land than he ever thought he'd own. He envisioned quiet weekends tending to his garden, evenings on a hammock under the trees, and dinners with friends on a future deck he planned to build himself. As he walked the perimeter of his new domain, his boots crunching over gravel and dried leaves, he couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He'd read the property deed twice before signing, confirming the lines ran clean through the wooded edge. It was all his, legally, officially, indisputably. The Homeowners Association had come up in the closing process, but it had seemed benign, even helpful. Their brochure spoke of community pride and neighborly cooperation, and he appreciated that they kept things clean and orderly. In fact, he'd been relieved the neighborhood had a group maintaining standards. He wasn't one to throw wild parties or leave junk in his yard. He respected structure. Inside the house, boxes were still piled in corners and furniture unassembled, but Alex didn't care. He grabbed a folding chair from the trunk and plopped it down on the grass out back, just beyond the kitchen door. As he sat and stared out at the patch of woods that now belonged to him, a breeze stirred the branches, and a cardinal landed on the fence post nearby. It felt like a sign, a quiet welcome home. For the first time in years, Alex felt like he could exhale. Everything he wanted was finally coming together. The calm didn't last long. Just 3 days after moving in, Alex was outside setting up a few solar lights along the path to the backyard when he heard the unmistakable click of heels on pavement. He turned to see a woman briskly walking toward him, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she'd just bitten into a lemon. She wore a pressed polo shirt embroidered with the HOA logo and a name tag that read Karen D in blocky letters. Her walk was confident, almost aggressive, and her eyes flicked over him and his yard like a scanner looking for violations. "Hello," she said with a tone that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. "You must be the new homeowner." Alex smiled and extended his hand. "Yeah, just moved in on Friday. I'm Alex." She didn't take his hand. Instead, her eyes dropped to the solar lights he was still holding. "Those will need to be approved if they're visible from the street. We have lighting uniformity guidelines." Alex blinked. "They're just pathway lights and they're behind the house." Karen gave a thin, tight smile. "Well, the rules are in the binder you received at closing. I suggest you read it carefully. We take compliance seriously in this neighborhood." The conversation didn't improve. Karen peppered him with rapid-fire questions: what color he planned to paint the shutters, whether he intended to install a shed, if he'd reviewed the lawn maintenance schedule. It felt less like a neighbor welcoming him and more like a customs inspection. She brought up a few complaints she claimed to have already received about the moving truck blocking the street, then warned him to keep things tidy during his unpacking. She made a point to mention she was the longest-standing board member and had a direct line to the city. By the time she walked away, Alex was stunned. He had dealt with fussy people before, bosses, clients, the occasional entitled neighbor, but Karen had a particular flavor of authority. It wasn't about helping or keeping order, it was about control. And something about the way she had eyed the wooded back portion of his yard left him uneasy, as if she was sizing it up like a chess piece she thought should belong to her side of the board. He shook it off and tried to laugh. One overzealous neighbor wouldn't ruin his dream home. Still, a small knot had started to form in his stomach. Something told him this wouldn't be the last time her heels echoed down his driveway. A few weeks passed and, for the most part, things settled into a rhythm. Alex kept to himself, spent evenings unpacking boxes, and used weekends to clear out the back portion of his lot. The place was even better than he'd imagined. The trees offered shade, birds nested in the branches, and the gentle rustling of leaves gave the yard a natural tranquility that felt like a private escape. It was here that he began laying out the early plans for his greenhouse. Nothing dramatic, just marking where the base would go, moving a few stones, and raking years of untouched leaves. It was quiet work, therapeutic. One afternoon, while digging out a patch near the tree line, he heard the voice again, sharp, assertive, and unmistakable. "You can't do that," Karen said from the other side of the fence. She stood with her arms crossed, her sunglasses reflecting the sunlight in a way that made her seem even more unapproachable. Alex turned, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm just clearing out some underbrush. This part's on my deed." She stepped forward, pointing toward the edge of the yard. "That section's considered common use property. It's not private. The HOA manages all of this buffer zone." Alex stood up straighter, suddenly aware that the moment he'd been hoping to avoid was now here. "My deed shows my property line running 5 feet past that oak tree. I double-checked it before buying." Karen's smile was patronizing. "Deeds don't override HOA zoning. You may want to read your covenants more carefully. We've had this come up before, and the board made it clear. Any modifications to that area require written approval." He tried to stay calm. "I'm not building anything yet, I'm just cleaning it up." "Intent matters," she said curtly. "We'll be reviewing your activity at the next meeting." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Alex stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding. Was she serious? He felt sure of his property lines, had studied them in detail, even pulled up the GIS survey on his phone after closing. Still, the doubt she cast crept into his mind like smoke through a crack in the window. The next morning, he woke to the sound of hammering. Looking out the back window, his stomach dropped. A new chain-link fence was being installed, stretching across the edge of his yard and cutting off everything he had cleared. Bright yellow markers were staked into the ground with the HOA's logo stamped on each. It was done overnight, no notice, no conversation. He stormed outside and asked the crew what they were doing. One of them just shrugged and said, "We're just following the work order." Later that day, a letter appeared in his mailbox. It was from the HOA stating that a protective boundary had been installed to preserve shared land integrity and that any attempts to tamper with it would result in fines. Alex stood behind the fence, staring at the land that was supposed to be his. Trees he had trimmed, earth he had raked, now sealed away behind cold metal. It felt less like a community and more like a siege. And for the first time, a flicker of anger burned beneath his disappointment. Something was wrong here, wrong enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. Alex spent the next few days in a haze of frustration. Every time he looked out the back window and saw that fence slicing through his yard, something tightened in his chest. It wasn't just about the land, it was the principle of it. He hadn't come to this neighborhood to pick fights or stir up drama, he had come for peace. But now, every morning started with the same hollow feeling, the same disbelief that someone could just take what was his and back it up with paperwork he'd never agreed to. He tried to resolve it the civil way first. He sent an email to the HOA requesting a meeting and followed up with a phone call. The response was polite but cold. All decisions regarding boundary clarifications are final as outlined in Section 4.7 of the HOA regulations. Thank you for your understanding. When he asked for a copy of that section, he was told it would be provided in due time. Not satisfied, Alex drove down to the county records office and pulled the original plat maps for the neighborhood. They matched his deed exactly. The fenced-off section was clearly within his property. Armed with that, he wrote a formal letter to the HOA board citing the discrepancy and requested the fence be removed. No reply. When he followed up again, the board's secretary sent a form letter stating the issue had been reviewed and resolved per current community guidelines. It felt like banging his head against a wall. Out of options, Alex decided to consult a lawyer. The firm he contacted specialized in real estate disputes and agreed to review his documents. A week later, he sat across from the attorney in a quiet office lit by fluorescent bulbs and weighed down with legal books. The attorney, a thin man in his 40s with kind eyes and a worn-out tone, gave it to him straight. "You've got a solid deed. The land's yours, no doubt. But HOA covenants can be tricky. Some of these associations write their own use agreements that complicate otherwise clear titles. If their documents say that area is common use, even if it contradicts your deed, you'd be stuck in court for months, maybe years. Alex leaned back, exasperated. So they can just take it? The lawyer hesitated. Not exactly, but they can make it painful enough that most people give up. That's the game. On top of that, the HOA began issuing him notices, citing him for unauthorized clearing, disturbance of soil near protected tree lines, and non-compliance with aesthetic standards. Each one came with a fine. The amounts weren't huge, but they piled up quickly, like a slow leak in a sinking boat. His mailbox became a source of dread. What had once been a home was starting to feel like a trap. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Some offered quick nods, but said nothing. He suspected many had their own stories, their own bruises from trying to stand up to the board, but no one spoke aloud. It was a quiet, polished place, one where rebellion had long ago been paved over by order and manicured lawns. At night, Alex sat in his living room staring at the same files over and over again. He knew he was right. He knew something was off. But the more he tried to fight, the more invisible walls he ran into. The system wasn't broken. It was rigged. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake buying into a place that smiled to your face while tightening the noose behind your back. The frustration was eating away at Alex. What began as a peaceful dream had become a waking nightmare, and the worst part was the feeling of helplessness. He was a rational man, organized, methodical. When things didn't add up, he didn't scream or throw punches, he researched. So that's what he did. He took time off work, brewed a pot of coffee each morning, and began combing through every legal document tied to his house and the neighborhood. If the HOA wanted to play games, he would learn the rules better than they did. He started with the deed again, highlighting every line, comparing the legal descriptions to satellite images, then cross-referencing those with county GIS maps. He went to the records office not once but 3 times that week, sitting for hours in the dusty archives, digging through old homeowners association bylaws, plat records, land covenants, anything that might explain how a private yard could suddenly be declared shared space without his knowledge or consent. The first few days yielded little. Most of the HOA documentation was updated every few years and deliberately vague, full of boilerplate language about community interests and landscape integrity. But something bothered him about the original plat map. The lines were so clean, so precise, and there was no mention, none at all, of any shared access or common buffer in the portion that was now fenced off. If it wasn't there from the beginning, it had to be added later. That was the crack in the wall. On the 5th day, while flipping through a brittle file marked Founding Declarations, 1977, Alex's eyes froze on a paragraph written in typewriter ink, slightly faded but still legible. It described the authority of the HOA, including its jurisdiction over shared properties, but then came a peculiar clause, buried deep in the text. It read, "Should any elected officer of the association impose structural changes upon a privately deeded parcel without due process or written consent of the deed holder, control of the association may be challenged and reassigned to the longest-standing deed holder within the original development, pending verification by county record." He blinked, read it again, then again. It wasn't a joke or a metaphor. It was an actual clause, likely forgotten, untouched for decades. It was also explosive. The clause had a sort of fail-safe logic. Back when the neighborhood was first formed, the developers must have wanted a way to keep the HOA from becoming too powerful or corrupt. And here it was, an obscure mechanism that essentially allowed a reversal of power if the HOA crossed a certain line. The kind of line that Karen had stomped over without hesitation. Alex's heart pounded. He reached for his file folder and flipped through the closing paperwork. There it was, his deed, registered just a year ago. But then he thought of something else, the elderly widow, 2 houses down, Mrs. Hartley. She'd mentioned over tea one day that she had lived there since 1978. She was the original owner. Her name was on the same development list. If she agreed to help, if she even knew about the clause, they might have a case. Excitement swelled in his chest, tangled with disbelief. It was a long shot, but it was more than he'd had before. The land may have been cut off, but the paper trail hadn't been. And now that trail pointed to something bigger than fences and fines. It pointed to a way out. Alex didn't waste a second. The next morning he walked over to Mrs. Hartley's house with a folder tucked under his arm and a flutter of nerves in his chest. She greeted him with a warm smile, still wearing her floral apron, the scent of cinnamon drifting from inside her kitchen. When he explained what he'd found, she invited him in without hesitation and sat him at her dining room table, listening intently as he laid out the clause, the timeline, the fence, and everything in between. Her brows furrowed as he read the passage aloud. She remembered something about it, vaguely. Back in the 70s, there had been concerns about the HOA gaining too much power too quickly, especially from the newer board members. She even recalled her late husband arguing at an early meeting about land rights and the need for checks on authority. When Alex showed her the file he found at the records office, she nodded slowly, then signed the statement he had drafted. It affirmed that she was the longest-standing deed holder within the original development and acknowledged the violation committed by the HOA president. With that signature, everything shifted. Alex took the signed affidavit and the original clause to his lawyer, who examined it with cautious curiosity. "This is unorthodox," the attorney said, "but it's legally binding if it's still on the books and hasn't been amended or revoked." They filed the documentation with the county clerk's office under an official petition to enforce the original covenant clause. Within days, a notice was sent to the HOA board requiring them to review the filing and respond publicly within 30 days. Karen predictably dismissed it all as desperate nonsense. She sent an email to the entire neighborhood calling it a ridiculous stunt and assuring everyone that the matter will be dealt with swiftly. But it wasn't up to her anymore. A mandatory meeting was scheduled by the county's legal observer to hear the matter formally, since the clause involved the potential transfer of HOA leadership. Karen tried to delay it, claiming scheduling conflicts, but was overruled when the county stated that ignoring the deed clause would constitute a violation of municipal homeowner governance law. A date was set for the following Wednesday, and every homeowner in the neighborhood received the same envelope in their mailbox: notice of covenant invocation and leadership review hearing. As word spread, so did curiosity. Neighbors who had long stayed quiet began whispering to each other at the mailboxes, outside the community center, at backyard fences. Alex noticed it in their glances, less pity now, more interest, more hope. It turned out he wasn't the only one who had felt steamrolled, silenced, or fined without justification. By the time the day of the meeting arrived, a low buzz had taken hold across the neighborhood. Karen looked calm on the surface, but her clipped words and darting eyes told a different story. She had built her power on fear, on the assumption that no one would ever challenge her. But now the paperwork was public, the law was engaged, and her authority rested on a clause she didn't even know existed. For the first time since the fence went up, Alex felt something like balance returning. Not vengeance, not arrogance, just the quiet confidence that the truth was finally catching up. The community center was fuller than anyone had seen it in years. Folding chairs lined the walls, everyone taken, with some neighbors standing in the back, arms crossed, curious, skeptical, or simply tired of the drama that had been bubbling just beneath the surface. At the front, a long table was set with microphones and stacks of documents. The HOA board members sat stiffly behind it, faces blank, expressions guarded. Karen took the center seat, her clipboard resting in front of her like a shield, eyes flicking across the room as if scanning for cracks in a dam she was trying desperately to hold together. Alex sat near the front with his attorney and Mrs. Hartley, who was unusually composed, her cane resting gently against her knee. The county observer, a soft-spoken woman in a grey blazer, called the meeting to order and began reading a prepared statement outlining the purpose of the assembly. This was no ordinary HOA gathering. This was a legal review under covenant law, prompted by the formal invocation of a clause that had been untouched for over 4 decades. The room quieted to a hush as the observer laid out the specifics: the historical deed provision, the requirement for public review, and the conditions under which HOA control could legally be transferred. Karen's expression didn't flinch, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. Then it was Alex's turn. He stepped forward, heart pounding but voice steady, and presented his case. He displayed the deed with its boundary lines, the county maps, the original plat plan, and then the clause, highlighted and enlarged on a poster board so no one could miss it. He read it aloud slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Should any elected officer of the association impose structural changes upon a privately deeded parcel without due process or written consent of the deed holder? The silence in the room was so heavy it felt like gravity had doubled. He then showed photos of the fence, copies of the notices he'd received, and the timeline of events. Every detail lined up. Every action the HOA had taken against him was undocumented, unauthorized, and most importantly, unsupported by anything in the neighborhood's governing rules. Finally, he handed the floor to his lawyer, who calmly explained how the clause triggered a power review and that, by the HOA's own original documents, leadership was to be reassigned to the longest-standing original deed holder, Mrs. Hartley, who sat quietly, her presence now carrying the weight of history itself. Karen broke her silence with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. She claimed the clause was outdated, irrelevant, overridden by newer amendments. But when asked to produce documentation proving it had been repealed, she faltered. The county observer gently but firmly reminded her that in the absence of a formal amendment filed with the clerk, original deed covenants remain enforceable. Her voice cracked as she began arguing over procedural language, but it was too late. The law didn't care about her tone or her self-importance. It only cared about what was written and what had been ignored. The final moment came when a vote was called, not for the board's opinion, but for community recognition of the leadership transfer, as stipulated in the covenant. One by one, hands went up across the room. Even some former board members who had sat silently through previous disputes raised their hands. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about accountability. When the last hand rose, the county observer nodded and signed the formal verification. Karen sat frozen, her clipboard still in front of her, now irrelevant. Control of the HOA was officially transferred to Mrs. Hartley, who graciously turned administrative duties over to Alex with the support of the room. Applause broke out, not wild or raucous, but genuine and long overdue. Karen stood up slowly, face blank, and walked out of the room without a word. Alex remained seated for a moment, letting it all sink in. After everything, the fence, the fines, the silence, it was over. The neighborhood had just watched power shift, not through rage or revenge, but through the very rules that were meant to protect them all, and he had found the one truth buried deep enough to break the cycle. The next morning felt different. The air seemed lighter, the birds louder, and the fence that had haunted Alex for weeks stood there not as a symbol of defeat, but as a final remnant of a battle already won. With the authority now firmly in his hands, and the paperwork filed with both the HOA office and the county, he didn't wait. He grabbed his toolbox, walked into the backyard, and stared at the chain-link barrier like a man looking at an insult ready to be erased. It took less than an hour. One bolt at a time, one panel after another, the fence came down. Each metallic clink echoed like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A few ventured out and stood at their fences watching in silence. Some even clapped quietly. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. The authority that once stood in his way had dissolved, and in its place there was space, open, unblocked, and finally his again. When the last section of the fence hit the ground, Alex stood in the reclaimed space, hands on his hips, breathing deep. The trees swayed overhead, untouched and proud. The soil he'd cleared weeks ago had already begun to dry and settle. He could see it now, his greenhouse, his deck, the hammock he'd planned, all fitting perfectly into the landscape as if nothing had ever disrupted it. The land hadn't changed, but he had. Later that week, Alex held a small gathering in his backyard. Not a party, just a quiet evening with some of the neighbors, Mrs. Hartley among them, sharing lemonade and soft conversation under the canopy of oaks. People opened up in ways they hadn't before. A retired couple spoke about how they'd been fined for having a bench too close to the sidewalk. Another woman admitted she'd stopped planting flowers after being told her pots were the wrong style. No one said Karen's name, but her presence lingered like an echo they were finally free to forget. Alex had already started revising the HOA guidelines, focusing on fairness, clarity, and respect for private property. He wasn't interested in revenge or control. He just wanted what he'd come here for in the first place: peace. And now, he wanted it for everyone else too. As twilight settled in and the soft hum of crickets rose from the brush, Alex looked around at the land he had nearly lost. It was his again, not just in name, but in spirit. And this time, he knew exactly how much it was worth. Karen didn't disappear overnight, but her grip unraveled faster than anyone expected. After the meeting, she stopped walking the neighborhood with her clipboard. The constant emails filled with citations and warnings abruptly ceased. Where she had once been omnipresent, patrolling with the authority of someone who believed herself untouchable, now she barely left her house. The transformation wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, gradual and inevitable. In the weeks that followed, Alex and the new interim board began reviewing old HOA files and digital records. What they found was a pattern: small but consistent misuses of funds, charges applied to non-existent violations, approval delays for home projects that had never been documented properly. The deeper they looked, the more it became clear that Karen had been running things not with the intent to serve the community, but to control it. There were discrepancies in budget reports and transactions that didn't match any known maintenance work. At first glance, nothing criminal. But unethical? Absolutely. At the next board meeting, with most of the neighborhood in quiet attendance, Alex presented a full audit. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't have to. The numbers spoke louder than words. Karen wasn't present that evening, but by the following day, she had sent an email resigning from all HOA duties, effective immediately. The message was short and void of apology. Just a line or two about her time being underappreciated and her decision to pursue other endeavors. No one was surprised. But the fallout didn't stop with her exit. A formal complaint was filed regarding the questionable expenses she had approved without board consent. The HOA insurance company launched an investigation. Fines were levied against her for unauthorized use of association funds, and a small claims case followed soon after. Karen contested it at first, but her argument crumbled under the weight of paperwork and community testimonies. She paid the fine, and after that, her house went up for sale. When the moving truck finally pulled into her driveway one quiet morning, few neighbors came out to watch. There was no celebration, no confrontation, just the sound of boxes being packed and tape being peeled, the end of an era loaded piece by piece into the back of a truck. By the afternoon, she was gone. Alex watched from his porch, not with smugness, but with quiet relief. It wasn't about punishment. It was about restoring balance, about proving that power misused could be undone. The space she left behind wasn't just an empty house. It was an opening, a breath of fresh air after years of pressure, and the neighborhood, still and silent beneath a blue sky, finally felt like it could breathe again. Spring settled in slowly, with warm breezes and the scent of new growth carried through the neighborhood like a promise. The garden Alex had once only imagined now stood proud and blooming at the edge of his yard, rows of herbs and vegetables, a neat gravel path winding between flower beds, and at the center, a small greenhouse framed in wood and glass. It caught the light in the mornings, glowing faintly, almost like it was alive. The land that had once been the center of a bitter fight was now exactly what it was meant to be, alive, productive, and peaceful. Each morning, Alex rose early, poured a cup of coffee, and stepped outside, barefoot, into the dew-covered grass. The quiet filled him in ways no conversation could. He'd work in the soil for an hour before logging into his remote job or running errands. Neighbors would wave from across the fence. Some would stop by with clippings to trade or just to chat. It was simple, honest, the kind of life he hadn't known he'd needed until it was nearly taken from him. Mrs. Hartley visited often, usually bringing homemade cookies or stories from the early days of the neighborhood. They'd sit on the garden bench, sipping iced tea, watching the birds dart through the trees. She told him she hadn't seen the community this content in years. People smiled more now, she said. They felt safer, freer, like the invisible weight of walking on eggshells had finally lifted. Alex never tried to control the HOA. Instead, he rewrote the rules with help from those who had stayed silent too long. They held monthly meetings in the park, open to all, and decisions were made with input instead of fear. Violations became rare. Not because people were afraid to break the rules, but because they respected the space they shared. The neighborhood healed itself in the quiet, steady way a garden grows, slowly, persistently, and always toward the light. Sometimes at dusk, Alex would sit beneath the oak tree at the back of his property, listening to the wind stir the leaves, watching the last bit of sunlight catch the roof of his greenhouse. He thought about everything, the fence, the resistance, the moments he doubted himself. He'd come here looking for rest and ended up discovering strength, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that holds its ground when no one's watching. The land was his again. But more than that, the peace was real. Not because someone granted it to him, but because he reclaimed it. And every flower that bloomed, every tomato that ripened, reminded him of one simple truth. Sometimes the hardest fights are the ones worth planting yourself into, because what grows after is freedom.